to At the Table, special edition, Chicago's Race for the Mayor. Joining me now is a panel of experts who know just about everything that's going on in the City Hall race. Fran Spielman of the Chicago Sun-Times City Hall reporter, Tina Sfondeles, the Sun-Times political reporter, Amy Qin, the WBEZ data reporter, and then we have consultants, Aviva Bowen from the strategy group, Tom Bowen from New Chicago Consulting, Joanna Klonsky, a consultant, and Ron Holmes, a consultant. Now, Tom and Joanna worked on the Lightfoot campaign. Aviva worked on Sophia King's mayoral campaign. Ron Holmes worked on an independent expenditure for the aldermanic campaigns. All the consultants are still working on different aldermanic campaigns, but I've gathered them here because of their expertise on what's going on in the race between Paul Vallas and Brandon Johnson for City Hall. Now, to set the stage for where the race is at, Fran Spielman, tell us what we need to know right now.
Are you sure this isn't the cast of the 10 Commandments, Lynn? I think so. We are probably in for a nail biter. This is turning out to be a really classic Chicago election. It'll break along racial lines, with Paul Vallas doing overwhelmingly well with the white Northwest Side, Southwest Side voters, Brandon Johnson getting the bulk of the Black vote, and the race will be decided on two things: on who gets the lakefront, particularly in the North Lakefront, and also who gets the biggest share of the Hispanic vote, and more importantly than anything, who gets their voters to the polls. And in that score, you have to believe that Brandon Johnson, with that huge army of CTU and SEIU members, has an advantage in terms of the ground game.
So, Amy Qin, you're the data reporter, and you wrote a terrific analysis with one of your colleagues on the first round voting on February 28th. So, Paul Vallas was first in 500 of the 1,300 precincts, second in 300 others. Brandon Johnson only had first place in 225. But the turnout that Fran talked about was only 35.8%. But tellingly, in the 19th ward that Vallas won was 58%. Could you explain how all wards are not equal when we're talking about all important turnout in the race between Johnson and Vallas?
Yeah, absolutely. So there were pretty wide gaps in turnout throughout the city, like you mentioned. And the 19th ward turnout was close to 60%, but in some wards, in majority Latino and Black areas of the city, turnout was less than 10%. And so, or some precincts, sorry. And so, one part of the race is who will be able to turn out some of these historically low turnout areas of the city. And what you'll see is that Paul Vallas did really well in areas of the city with high turnout. So the 19th ward, the 41st ward near O'Hare, and Brandon Johnson as well. He captured a lot of the far north side lakefront wards that have historically had pretty high levels of turnout, as well as areas like Logan Square and Avondale and Bucktown. And so I think the question remains, who's going to get some of these voters out to the polls in historically low turnout areas that Lori Lightfoot and Willie Wilson and Chuy Garcia won in the February election.
So, Tom Bowen, as Amy Qin just described, Paul Vallas has a huge built-in structural advantage. We're not even talking about the ads or the foot soldiers. How does a consultant, how does a campaign, if you're Brandon Johnson, how do you grapple with the built-in structural advantage that your candidate is, since all wards are not equal, is the winner of the biggest turnout wards?
Yeah, I wouldn't assume a structural advantage for Vallas. Remember that Chicago is a pretty Democratic city. We vote about 80% Democratic preference. And the majority of that broken up vote in that first round was Democrats competing with each other for those votes. So the way you would normally think about a race for mayor in Chicago is the Democratic candidate has the advantage, and Vallas has done a lot of work to make sure that he is not labeled as a Republican in his advertising. So I don't necessarily agree that he has an advantage. I think both campaigns actually come at this from a bit of a flawed perspective. Both have bases from the extreme left and the extreme right. And the winner is going to be who convinces the middle that they aren't going to be beholden to that base.
So, Joanna, in the Lightfoot campaign, the mayor tried and did push to the end that Vallis was a closet Republican. Brandon Johnson, as Fran and everyone's been reporting, is being hit hard. It's hitting Vallis hard on this front. What's your analysis of how this allegation is being played out and the impact it may have in turning out voters?
Yeah, that is an important question. And I think that, as Tom said, we're in a massively Democratic city. When what we saw in our campaign was that when voters learned about Vallis's questionable history, sort of buddying up with Republicans, they didn't like it. It was pretty simple. There's a reason why the mayor said it over and over again in her campaign. That being said, Paul Vallis is on TV with millions of dollars, calling himself a pro-choice lifelong Democrat. And it remains to be seen whether Brandon Johnson's campaign is able to define Vallis at such a competitive disadvantage in terms of how much he's spending on TV ads to tell people about that Republican track record. So that's the big question to me, is voters don't like it when they learn about it, but are they going to learn about it in enough time? Okay,
so Tina, one of the things that is going on right now is an endorsement war. So each of them have a whole string of endorsements, but like all awards aren't equal, all endorsements aren't equal. Vallis has one of the most popular Democrats in the state, Jesse White, for him. Can you kind of talk us through a little bit about, and every day there's new endorsements coming. How is this endorsement work playing out? And then I want all of you to chime in on this point too, but starting with Tina.
Well, that seemed to be his goal immediately the day after he was rounding out the endorsements. That's part of their strategy right now, is every day rolling out these important endorsements, rather, a lot of Black pastors, a lot of Black politicians that are influential. Jesse White, as you said, Jesse White has helped to bring out the vote for many people over decades. So that is a very influential person to have endorsed him. So they are banking on these people kind of following what these endorsements say. It's the money and the endorsements that's Paul Vallis's game right now. And also the TV, being on TV and trying to point out who he is.
You have the regular Democratic, the old guard Black aldermen like Harris and Burnett and Sawyer and Beal. Those people are lining up with Vallis. And then you have the more progressive Blacks going with, for the most part, with Brandon Johnson. You have Jason Irvin, whose wife probably wants to run for Congress, the city treasurer, Melissa Conyers Irvin, lining up with Brandon Johnson. You have Jeanette Taylor on the South Side. And then you have the interesting one for me was Attorney General Kwame Raoul, which helped Johnson greatly because he's being accused of being for the defunding police. He has a history of saying it. He's not saying it now. But when you have the state's chief law enforcement officer for Johnson, that kind of validates the fact that he's not so radical after all.
And you have a good point, because he didn't have to get into this. Governor Pritzker's staying neutral. Aviva Bowen, what is the impact, though, of having these testimonies? Do you think that will make a difference? Or is there almost like endorsement gridlock here?
Yeah, I mean, at a certain point, I think it becomes just kind of a list of endorsements and you get a little fatigued by it. I think the question is, for the undecided voters who really do not feel as though they align with either candidate, perhaps they think one is far too left and the other is far too right, and they're not really sure who represents their worldview or perspective. An endorsement can help those late breaking voters with a seal of approval, right? They say, I'm not really sure, but I've always loved Jesse White, or I'm not really sure, but look at all of these progressives lining up with Brandon Johnson. It might help them along, but I think what's more important with endorsements, beyond just the names we put on mail and TV and in the news, is what they provide the candidate. Some are going to provide money, and at a certain point, it's just going to be too cluttered. But those, I think, that can provide some boots on the ground to drive the enthusiasm in these last 2 weeks, I think that's going to be really critical.
Mhm. So Ron, you have been working in all levels of politics in your career, local, state, Springfield, Washington. So when I look at Brandon Johnson, he's the only one that's really, in a sense, nationalized his campaign because he has the endorsements of Elizabeth Warren. He was a Warren delegate when she ran for president, and Bernie Sanders. And they've been tweeting out some stuff. So they're pretty good when you're trying to prove what? That you need to put together the progressive coalition that might have been splintered with Chewy, who hardly got any votes. What's the impact of having these, and also other members of the Congressional Black Caucus have weighed in, but I don't know how household their names are in Chicago. What's the impact of having these national figures weigh in for Johnson, Ron?
Yeah, so Brandon did something, in my opinion, very smart, and that was he realized that there were going to be a lot of Black surrogates within the city of Chicago that were heading Paul's way. And so he has kind of used Congressional Black Caucus members, very progressive members, by the way, that can then say like, hey, here are Black folks that also support Brandon Johnson. So he's really using them in a way that says like, hey, if I can't find validators here that people trust, why don't I find some additional names from outside of the state? We've also seen Brandon also use ads from places that Paul has done work across the state, saying, hey, we know Paul Vallis, and what we would say is he's not good for our city, so he won't be good for Chicago. So in Brandon's quest, to kind of navigate some of the roadblocks that he's run into with the establishment here in Chicago, he's just gone out and got other names, other faces to, again, add to this kind of daily messaging war that happens in terms of, well, no, I've got Black people that support me. I've got progressives that support me. I've got law enforcement that supports me as well. And he's really just finding these other bodies to use to kind of get through the day.
So, Amy, in your analysis, where are votes to be found? Where do you think in a way, I'm kind of astounded that people could still be undecided at this point, but where do you think are the fertile areas based on where you could increase turnout? What wards can you squeeze more votes out of, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. Just, citywide, combined, Vallis and Johnson won about 55% of the vote, but, there's the other kind of 45% of where voters are going to vote. And I think a lot of that is going to come from where Lightfoot was strong, where Willie Wilson was strong, and where Chuy Garcia was strong. And where these people won is kind of largely along racial lines. You see that Chuy Garcia pretty much won a lot of the precincts on the southwest and northwest sides that were majority Latino and majority Black precincts. Lori Lightfoot got about 40% of the vote there, with Billy Wilson coming in second place. And so I think where Vallis and Johnson need to kind of battle out for voters is in these majority Latino and Black precincts. And in terms of turnout, they've historically and in this election been just a lot lower. Turnout in majority white precincts was 45%, but turnout in majority Latino precincts and majority Black precincts was just less than 30%. So it's a kind of 15% turnout gap on average. And so I think it'll be a really important question to see, who wins the hearts and minds of these kind of Lightfoot, Willie Wilson, and Garcia voters.
So I know I see a lot of ads out there, digital ads that somehow, even though I'm in Washington, some make their way to me because of what I'm reading. Can we just do a spin around the bend? Is it, what is working now? Is it one-on-one door knocking? Is it some social media? Let's do Tom, Joanna, Tina, Ron, Aviva, and then Fran. What is the thing that you think works most effectively right now? Tom?
Continuity is what works. And it's a message in multiple places that's all saying the same thing. And one thing I want to caution people on in the race for Chicago mayor compared to race for Senate, governor, state senate, all these other things. Chicago voters pay attention to this. you can be at a lower wattage and people still pick up what's going on in a medium such as broadcast TV, because it is the basics like picking up your garbage. But the issues of public safety, of education, of your quality of life in your city are extremely important to people. So they pay attention. And I think if you are saying things in different places that's a little confusing or cross current, that is the problem. But I don't think there is any particular mix that's effective. I just think the continuity is what matters.
Okay, Joanna?
I agree with Tom, and I would also say that these negative messages that you're seeing millions of dollars poured into these TV ads and informing voters about Vallis's history on questionable positions on abortion rights, on comfort with Republicans, and similarly, Vallis is attacking Brandon with millions of dollars, saying he's going to defund the police and raise your taxes $800 million. Those things, they have to be addressed. Both campaigns have to really take strong steps to make sure that they're combating that before either of them is defined. It isn't yet clear to me whether voters are open to these messages that they're hearing in the press and absorbing them to combat what they're seeing in their TV ads constantly.
Okay, what do you think, Tina?
I think that kind of along the same lines as Tom and Joanna, that there has to be consistency in their messaging, and we're not really seeing that in these debates, these rapid fire debates that Fran has been covering every day. There's so many, but just the messaging of what is Brandon Johnson's tax plan. There are things that are kind of trickling out of that. Paul Vallis defending the money and whether he's a Republican. It's just the voters have to hear a consistent message about who these people are, what the issues are, or they can lose some of those voters.
Okay, Franny?
Well, you know, I was a panelist on the 1983 debates. I hate to admit that, but it's true, I'm that old. I was a panelist on the Jane Byrne, Harold Washington debates, one of them. And the other panelists were Chinda Strasberg and David Axelrod. That's how long ago that was. And those debates were absolutely critical. Harold Washington, in his charm and winning personality, showed himself to be someone who people felt comfortable with. I still remember Breezek must go, he said. And he won that election, I think, in large part at those debates. The question about these debates is anybody watching them? Definitely, Brandon Johnson is the more talented communicator. He has the gift of gab. He's charming. He makes the human connection. Paul Vallis is a technocrat. He was a stammerer and a stutterer as a young kid. He overcame that. He has a shell that it's hard for him to break out of. And so I think if anyone's watching, they probably are more inclined to warm up to Brandon Johnson. But is anybody watching?
So Aviva, I am shifting gears because we're going to move on now to debates. Why did these candidates agree to so many debates in the runoff? What's in it for them?
Well, I think, you know, on a one-on-one, I think they know it's very close. They know that, you know, they have kind of shored up their bases at this point. And we, you know, Amy and others have talked about where those lie and that they are fighting for the undecided middle. So they are using these opportunities in a one-on-one to, you know, drive some coverage, hopefully, that Fran and others are pushing out. And the hope there, I think, you know, is perhaps something occurs, perhaps they can make some news, perhaps they can do something that creates a headline that can frankly be then used in paid advertising, right? And I think that to your question of, you know, what's working best right now, I think it is an all of the above and a consistency and an authenticity that is important. But I think it's also critical to understand that, you know, the candidate who is meeting people exactly where they are is going to be successful with that group of people, right? Paul Vallis in the first round was laser focused on the issue that most people would rank as their number one concern, which is public safety and crime. And those who want a single focus, as Fran said, a technocratic approach, a results focus on public safety may go to Vallis. But Brandon Johnson is speaking to a movement. He's speaking to a progressive vision for the city, and that's driving enthusiasm as well. So I think meeting people where they are and using some targeting and advertising is going to be a factor as well.
So Ron, are these debates framing it as there's one man and there's a movement? Is that the point of the debates? Do you think that these campaigns, is that their strategy, that how they're trying to say one individual can make a change and the other is saying I'm part of a movement that can make a change? Is that kind of a meta message that's going out, or am I off base?
Yeah, I'm not so sure. I mean, I think when you listen to some of these debates, Paul has gone out of his way to talk about the amount of support that he's generated from Black aldermen and unions across the board, while Brandon has talked a lot about the multi-generational, multicultural, coalition that he has built. The reality is that for both of these candidates pre-runoff, they struggled to raise money. And the idea that any platform that allowed them to tell their story probably is why they agreed to so many of these forums during the runoff. But money has come pouring in. And so while a lot of these candidates or both of these candidates are using their money to drive negatives, I think in both cases, you have a Paul Vallis who thinks that he can outwalk Brandon on a debate stage and kind of poke at some of the things that Brandon has advocated for. And I think for Brandon, you have noticed that his talking points about Paul being a Republican and being anti-choice is something that he uses every time he gets a question. So I think both of them, both camps feel that like when you put the other guy on the stage, they have an opportunity to expose them, but we really haven't seen that huge gotcha moment that can maybe go viral in the last week and a half or so.
So we still have 3 debates left, Fran?
There's one at Channel 2. Now, remember, every station wants their time. So that's part of the reason why. What about me? What about me? So every network station is getting their moment in the sun. I think there's just one more in terms of a televised debate.
On it. And so when we talk about negative ads, by the way, so Vallis has going for him this Priorities Chicago Super PAC run by Greg Goldner, and we have no idea where the money's coming from. They just got from wherever another 300,000, and all this is to run negative ads against Johnson. Does anyone see? Is this a big deal? Does Johnson? We don't see any dark money coming in at that level for Johnson. What panel? What's the impact? Someone jump in and let me know.
I wouldn't pay a ton of attention to, the so-called outside groups here. Chicago's rules, the state of Illinois' rules allow candidates to take unlimited contributions, and candidates get a lower price to advertise on TV than these outside groups. I think the reasons people do these outside groups are a lot more for the parochial interests of those specific donors. But the real action is in the candidate committees.
So when we talk about the different ways that we approach as political analysts Chicago, we've talked that because Chicago is still so segregated, we could talk about the Black wards, Hispanic wards, lakefront liberals, who I guess still exist as an entity. But Amy, one of the things we saw is that the youth vote was low comparatively, especially in the early vote when we saw those numbers. As far as I know, there is not really structured youth vote outreach. Is there just not worth it? Is the youth vote, do you think, just a place no one has time to dwell in? Because is it a lost cause or no in Chicago? What's your analysis?
Yeah, the youth vote was abysmal this time around. It was under, I think, 3% for the 18 to 25 age bracket. And as someone who actually just turned 26, I'm no longer in that bracket. I feel like there are some groups who have been working. Chicago Votes comes to mind. They've done a lot of outreach for youth voters, Black and Brown youth voters in the South and Southwest sides. But I don't speak for everyone in that age group anymore, I guess. But I think there's kind of just this sense of what's the point, like all of these politicians, they make these promises, but what does that actually mean for me and my family? And so I think there's a lot of negativity and disillusionment among Gen Z and younger millennials. And so, the hope is that things changed this time around. I think there's been, as everyone has mentioned, just a lot more buzz and interest nationally in this election as well, and a lot more coverage. And so hopefully, through TikTok or Instagram or whatever, people get informed and turn out to vote. And
Okay, but remember, we started the show with Fran saying this is down to the wire. So panel of political experts here, why is no one going after the youth vote? Is that?
Well, I mean, if you were Brandon Johnson and he was counting on the under 49 crowd, and he was counting on, he keeps talking about multi-generational, multi-ethnic and so on. Young people talk a good game, they complain a lot, they don't vote. And if I were Johnson, I'd be going to college campuses and I'd be riling up. I mean, look at all the campuses we have. I would be having events constantly on these campuses and trying to get them to take them to the polls or get them to vote. Do something to try to rile up this group. Maybe Bernie Sanders can help.
Well, does anyone think Bernie Sanders is going to come in, or Elizabeth Warren? We just don't know it. Do you think that, because that could be again?
Well, Jason Lee talked about that and said, oh, we're working with them, but time is ticking away here.
Right. I was at the last Bernie Sanders rally. It was right days before everything shut down with the pandemic. It was in Grant Park. He filled that park and everybody was half our ages. Okay. That's the kind of people to the polls thing that could really, I can't think of any other people who could really get a mass of people, intergenerational, then maybe a Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. If they both came, that would be giant. Now we're kind of getting to our close. I want to just talk about, when we turn to crime, major issue in the campaign, State's Attorney Kim Foxx seems to have surfaced as an issue. Paul Vallis has 8 ways to try and work around her, and Brandon Johnson leans into the restorative justice view that, or in actions that she's taken. This does mirror some movements nationally, by the way, when it comes to local prosecutors. Is there a Kim Foxx factor for undecided voters? Fran, you're nodding no.
No, I don't think so. I mean, this is predictable. You have a candidate of the FOP who has their endorsement, who has hammered away at law and order, who wants to fully fund the police department, fill the vacancies, hire retired cops. I mean, he's been hammering away at that. So Paul Vallis, of course, and he's been writing on Facebook and doing all these things for years about Kim Foxx. On the other hand, you have Brandon Johnson. So the fact that they disagree on how good a job she's done, that's not a surprise at all. Brandon Johnson is not committing to fully funding the police budget of $1.94 billion. He is not committed to filling the vacancies that we have. In fact, he wants to cut $150 million from the police budget by reducing the number of supervisors. And he wants to shift the money to the alternate response. So, I mean, the fact that Kim Foxx they differ, of course they do.
Mm-hmm. So Tina, do you think this race is also that in a sense, the candidates are stand-ins for the unions that are backing them, the Fraternal Order of Police with Vallis and the Chicago Teachers Union for Johnson?
Well, they will deny that, but there's that perception because of the money, because the foot soldiers, say for Brandon Johnson and the CTU, he mentions being a teacher at every instance. Mentions being part of the organization, but then has to talk about how he won't be a dues paying member if he wins. And so there's a question there about loyalties and what he will do when it comes to CTU things as mayor, and the same for Paul Vallis of what he will do with police, because he's heavily backed by the Fraternal Order of Police. And as Fran said, it seems to be kind of forming his policy on how he would fund police as well.
So what union is more powerful in just getting votes out?
CTU, SIU, SEIU, they have foot soldiers galore. Brian Hopkins told me that he says this is the new army. He said they were 5, 6, 7 deep in all precincts, even the ones that Brandon Johnson was not expected to do well. They poured out to the polls for him on election day, February 28th. So they are more powerful, I believe.
So let me put, this is a provocative, hopefully, question as we wind down. We're in our closing minutes. in a sense, did the FOP endorsement for Vallis just cost him more aggravation than it was worth? They haven't given him a dime. They don't have foot soldiers.
He
and-
doesn't want their money.
Right,
He asked
right.
not to take their money.
But that's diminishes in some way what you sometimes you get. So panel, was this FOP endorsement worth it in that he would probably have these voters anyway? Let's start with Aviva and then we'll go see who has to say anything. What do you think?
I mean, probably not. I think it's a shorthand for a lot of people who are trying to categorize candidates. They say, okay, he's the FOP guy, Brandon is the CTU guy. You know, it's a way for them to kind of organize their thoughts and identify. But to your other question, which union is more impactful? I think it goes beyond just having the Army, the foot soldiers, what have you on the ground. And Fran's right, CTU, SEIU asked me, they have a lot of boots, right? But I also think it is a matter of how many people identify with those points of view, right? You have teachers, paraprofessionals, folks who are working in city services who see the CTU, who see Brandon and say they see themselves in that. And I think that outnumbers, as far as the unions go, the number of members of the FOP.
In closing, I want to do takeaways with everyone. And I think sometimes it's just a useful way of kind of summarizing and condensing what we've learned so far. This takes this question for what you will about behavior of voters, of candidates, what motivates people or not. I know, Amy, you did a great takeaways from the February 8th election, looking to April 4 and as voting is going on. What takeaway do you have so far that you can analyze or share with us?
Yeah, I think something that actually gets lost in the shuffle a bit is that Paul Vallis won 500 some odd of the 1,300 precincts in the city, but Brandon Johnson actually came in the top 3 vote getters in close to 1,000 precincts. And so this is kind of support for Brandon Johnson citywide. It seems like he may not be the first vote getter, but he is second or third. And so I think that's kind of my big takeaway, I guess, from February 28th is that, kind of continuing with the theme, right, looking beyond, who's the top vote getter. I think Vallis is really, really strong in some areas of the city, but it does kind of look like Johnson has, he comes second or third pretty much in every precinct that, and a lot of precincts that
that would be, so if we had ranked choice voting, that would be everybody's second choice. But thank you for that insight, because it means he might have more room to grow and is not dependent on, frankly, maybe high turnout white wards. Joanna, your takeaway.
Yeah, I think that Brandon Johnson needs to run up the score in every Black ward and in those white liberal wards. Paul Vallis has done a bit of work to reach into that Black electorate base and try to peel off some of that. It's unclear to me whether endorsements alone, I don't think endorsements alone will deliver the Black vote for Vallis, even in the wards where he has the alderman or the committeeman supporting him. And I think that's likely because of your last question. The FOP comes with a lot of liability. That endorsement is problematic for many people across demographics. And so it remains to be seen for me how much Vallis can actually pull from Johnson's base in the Black community to get across the line.
Okay, Tina, what do you think?
My takeaway is that 5 weeks is not a lot of time. It's not enough time, I think, especially for some of these like Lightfoot voters or people who voted for other people to be convinced. I think in some cases they might not come out to vote. Maybe that's like a disenchanted view of this race, but it's up to these candidates to do what they can do to get those people out, especially Lori Lightfoot voters.
Mm-hmm. And Ron, your takeaway?
Yeah, I agree with Tina. I mean, what I'm looking for is where do the undecideds go? I mean, I think there's a lot of people that are still wondering how do we get here with these 2 specific candidates. And for those that are kind of stuck in the middle, continue to learn more about these candidates, but more importantly, continue to feel more comfortable about voting for one of these candidates is a thing that I'm going to be watching for over the next couple of weeks.
Fran Bowen.
I'm looking for the second round to mimic a little bit of what I think happened in 2015 is a little bit of a lot of, confusing choices in the first one. And the second one, there's a real clarified contrast and turnout goes up. Now, who those extra voters are, I can't tell you, but it wouldn't surprise me if we get higher turnout in round two.
Fran, we started with you and I would like to end with you because you're the giant among us, living and breathing everything City Hall.
I am not a giant. It's interesting. Lori Lightfoot spent a lot of money in the first round trying to eliminate Chuy Garcia as her opponent. She wanted to pick Paul Vallas as her opponent, and I think she left him alone mistakenly. She left Johnson alone until it was too late. She felt that Paul Vallas had a ceiling, and this is what we're going to find out. Did Paul Vallas have a ceiling, and does Johnson have so much more room to grow that he ends up winning a nail biter?
Thank you for that insight, because that matches and actually, I forgot, Aviva, we will get to you. Fran, you were not the last one, because what Fran said builds on Amy's point that Johnson has perhaps more room to grow. So Aviva, dance us out and your takeaway, because you have so many years of analysis. What wisdom can you share with us? What do you see?
A few less than you and Fran, but I appreciate that.
Yes.
I think, there are a group of voters who have not yet decided. I think there is a lot of fear and uncertainty amidst the entire electorate, coming out of a pandemic, coming out of, a crossroads where crime is at a high. I think the candidate who can speak to those voters and give them a sense of both security and enthusiasm for the future is going to be successful. And then whoever wins is going to have a tall order of bringing the city together and moving forward.
Wow, how right that is. And we'll all be here to see it. To my panel, to us, to the city who's hanging on this election, I thank you so much for sharing the collective knowledge that all of you bring to this edition of At the Table. Take care. Joining me now are two freshmen from the Illinois congressional delegation, Congressman Jonathan Jackson and Congresswoman Delia Ramirez. I talked to them during orientation week in Washington, and I've seen them around a few times, but let's just check in with them now and let's see how the freshman experience is going for two of our newest members. And hello, Congressman Jackson. Hello, Congresswoman Ramirez. Thanks for joining me. And so our listeners know you're two of the four members of the new four members of the Illinois delegation, but you're the two from the Chicago area. So we'll talk about, and we'll get to, so everybody who's listening at the very end, I am going to ask you about mayoral politics, but because that's what everybody is hanging on to right now in Chicago. But I want to get the sense of what it's like to be a freshman. So Congressman Jackson, you have been around Washington a lot in your life, through your work, your father's work. But now when you came here as a member of Congress, what happened that you didn't expect?
Well, just the probably the orthodoxy of the institution. It's the process by which bills are passed and the outreach amongst members, the pace at which these decisions are made. That's been quite interesting and very exhilarating to see the shift in power from Democrat to Republican and how rules change and opportunities to get on committees. For example, there are no freshmen on the Education and Workforce Committee. So for the 118th Congress, the committee was reduced. Education is a big issue for all of us in our workforce. That's one. The other, which is just when I say the orthodoxy, how the institution is set up, that some people, for example, in Manhattan can walk their district, and other people in Texas can have a 10, 12-hour drive across their district. And so just the variety of districts, and that everyone in the Congress ran for office. No one was appointed. You can be appointed a governor, a senator, a Supreme Court justice, but everyone here ran for office. And so it gives me an enormous amount of respect for them and respect for the part of the country they come from.
So Congressman Ramirez, when we talked during freshman orientation, you told me about the sticker shock you got when you came to Washington. And when I say sticker shock, it was just the price of housing. You ended up with a roommate. Could you tell in kind of a short version of the story of how you came to Washington as a seasoned lawmaker in Springfield, no stranger to commuting? Tell me about that tell the sticker shock story, would you?
Well, I think most people, when they run for Congress, they don't assume that they'll have to pay $3,000 a month out of pocket for their housing. And especially those of us that live in Chicago in a community that continues to become more expensive. I'd say to you, I'm at orientation and I'm looking through my 10 appointments to go check out apartments. And the cheapest one was $2,500, but that didn't include amenities. And you know, you're thinking about what is security going to look like? Do I need to live in a building? And how quickly can I get back to the Capitol? And so I turned around and I looked at Congresswoman Lee and I said, did you find an apartment already? And it was the best face for me because her face told me, no, I haven't. And oh my God, these prices. So Congresswoman Lee and I decided to rent a little row house just a few minutes from the Cannon Building. And actually we're renting from a former congressperson who's committed to renting to future congresspeople who he believes to be progressive. So we're splitting the rent. We have a 3-bedroom. And honestly, it's the only way that we both would have been able to do it. I know people think of it as, oh my gosh, you're making so much more money. When you look at what we bring back after taxes, it's okay money, but it also means you have to get new suits, you have to do this, you have to do that, and you pay everything out of pocket. So housing to me was one of the biggest sticker shocks.
So Jonathan, you've been around town. What did you do about housing?
I'm staying with a friend now. I'm committed to that for the first 90 days. And now I'm in the market looking for an apartment. I had so many decisions to make. I pumped the brake, but having a lot of friends in town, I've been able to crash for the first 90 days.
So are you like on people's couches every week or?
Just one person's couch.
Oh.
We're only here almost like 10 days a month, so 15 days a month, so it's not bad. Well, and it's a crash. It's a crash pad for me. I'm here. I was here this morning at 6:30. I'm usually checked back in by 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock after dinner, go to bed and get back up.
Well, when you talk about the size of districts and your congressional colleagues, at least the two of you, Delia, you're close to O'Hare. Jonathan, you're close to Midway compared to what your colleagues have to do. You're, at least as the commute goes, it's not bad. But here's my question for you, Delia Ramirez, new freshman, but you were a seasoned lawmaker in Springfield. Springfield, in your experience there as a member of the state house, was controlled by Democrats. The whole apparatus was Democratic run. You're coming in as a freshman with a GOP house. Explain how you had to get that through. You know, how does that settle in your head? And can you compare and contrast lawmaking in Springfield to what you see so far in the few months you've been in Washington?
Yeah, let me start with the second question first. I have to tell you, and I tell this to a lot of people, having been a state legislator, specifically in Illinois, in some ways will prepare you for Congress. If you've ever had to run a bill at 3 a.m. during the lame duck in Springfield, having been going since 7 a.m., that in itself has stretched your muscles of resilience, I think, in a way that very few places will do for you. So getting acclimated to the travel schedule has been so-so, but driving almost 4 hours to Springfield and 5 on a snow day, I honestly tell you, is far more brutal than a 2-hour flight to DC from Chicago. It's really made a difference. Look, caucuses are pretty similar, right? If I'm in a Dem caucus, there are colleagues of mine in Congress that remind me of colleagues of mine in Springfield. I have little running jokes. I've called some of them this person reminds me of you. When you ask this question, this
Yeah.
person asked the question the same way. And then I would say to you, the majority minority, obviously, it's very different, right? I was also in leadership. So, now I'm a freshman under a minority, and a minority by very few. So I would say to you, what makes a big difference for me, and I think it would have been worse, would have been if we would have lost by 10, 15, 20
Yeah.
seats. So it gives me an opportunity as I've looked at committees, even committee selection.
Yeah.
What were the committees that I could go into where I can have a bigger impact on message and actual bills? So being in the Veteran Affairs Committee, there are a number of things that we're working on in a bipartisan manner that you wouldn't assume coming into minority. That's been that game I've had to play, right? What's a strategic way to make the most impact given the circumstances of minority? And I think that also it helps to come from organizing.
Mhm.
So it's been different, honestly. And I've also been in a room where rules are being made as we go by some folks. So figuring that out and just thinking majority 2024, I think has been the encouraging way to go.
So let me go on the committee assignments. So here's the brutal truth for all our listeners is that it's really hard to get on the top committees in Congress. And forgive me, I know I'm switching between calling you Congressman Jackson and Congressman Ramirez. It's just because I do know you. And so I'm not being disrespectful. I'm going to try and stick with Congressman Jackson and Congressman Ramirez. I know that and I have reported that Congressman Ramirez and Congressman Jackson may have some big asks. They wanted to try and get on some of the major committees, but they had a few strikes against them going in. Freshmen who come from relatively safe districts, and I would say Jonathan Jackson is a super safe district. Delia Ramirez is less safe, but pretty safe district. No one needs to do you any favors by giving you a higher profile. So Jonathan ended up on the Committee on Agriculture, and I'll explain that in a minute, and then I will let you why that is not as strange as it may sound, and the Committee on Foreign Affairs and the Africa Subcommittee. Now, Congressman Bobby Rush, whose shoes you are filling, realized a few years ago when in a previous remap that even though I may think of you as a member of Congress rooted in Chicago, your district takes in farmland and the exurbs. You never came to Congress campaigning, I'm going to be on the Ag Committee, but you did land on Foreign Affairs, which was pretty good. Now, Congressman Ramirez, you're on the Committee on Homeland Security, the Border Security and Enforcement, subcommittees and oversight. And then, as you said, you're on the Vet Affairs Committees. Neither of these were your first choices. So in the context of the freshman experience, first, Congressman Jackson, how did you navigate it? And when did it really come clear to you that with all the people you knew, I know you had Maxine Waters going to bat for you to try and get on financial affairs. When did it kind of dawn on you that the enormity of this committee selection process?
Oh, I don't know. It was like first you run for the seat, then you run for leadership within your class, then you run for your committee assignments. And so because the process had been delayed for the speaker being selected, everything was pent up, and then everything had to be jettisoned through in a hurry after the rules because everything had been delayed. And then there was a scramble. Of course, the Republicans can take their pick of committee assignments, and we had to pick what was left. My first choice was for financial services, something I've taught, markets that I've worked in. I've been a runner on the Chicago Board of Trade. I've been a runner on the New York Stock Exchange. So I've been very comfortable in financial institutions. And then when I had a chance to catch my breath and started reading up on what was available, and agriculture just started looming and getting bigger and bigger. Agriculture got me back to financial institutions. There's the Farm Bank, there's the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, there's the Chicago Board of Trade, there's the underlying derivatives market, and so it is a bank. It does have the markets, and then I saw the food programs in there, and it's a fully funded farm bill year. So I was like, whoa, this is amazing. And then I spoke with the House Minority Leader, Mr. Hakeem Jeffries, and shared with him what was left. And he was going to bat for me. He said, that's a good committee to be on this year. And so I went to Congressman Scott and others and said, I'd like to request participation on the Agriculture Committee. So it worked out. And I looked at the Foreign Affairs as the same coin, but the opposite side, that food security around the world, food security in the country. Illinois is exporting 60% of our corn abroad. The jobs that it means, the Mercantile Exchange is one of our largest employers. Citadel is was one of our biggest asset managers. The manufacturing with Boeing, its headquarters. So I ended up really beyond my wildest imagination on where I would want to be, dealing with manufacturing, financial institution, agriculture, and the financial institutions.
So Congresswoman Ramirez, did you find this navigating this committee assignment process? How did you figure it out, and when did it I mean, both of you are not naive and you've been around, but until you live it, how hard was it, or disappointing, or how did you deal with not getting what you wanted at first, but coming to what you have?
Yeah. I'll tell you that I remember the day after Jonathan and I both knew that we weren't going to get the committees we wanted, but we had some real opportunity to consider others. We both looked at each other and said, well, good thing we're from Chicago and we're savvy and we figure out how to make the best out of wherever we are. Yeah, look, I wanted financial services too. It was my second choice, and I wanted transportation and infrastructure. I have all the parking lots of O'Hare, but right now this whole argument about the rail line and the railroad mergers that are happening in particular suburbs that are all in my district are really important, and being in that committee was incredibly important. So my team and I started thinking, well, what are the things that I wanted to do in financial services, like Jonathan just mentioned. Why did I really want to be in transportation and infrastructure? What are the things you want to accomplish, especially in the midst of a minority? And veteran affairs had always been my number 3. I don't think people think of progressives in veteran affairs. And I also don't think that people knew that my background prior was running a social service agency where I used to house 20% of the people I housed were veterans who were homeless, right? So selecting veteran affairs became my number 1 after we had to renegotiate where we could go. And particularly making sure that I'd be in the subcommittees that would focus on 2 things. Immigration. You never think of immigration in veteran affairs, but there are a number of veterans who have been deported. Something happened, a DUI, immediately after they came back, something happened, and all of a sudden they've been deported. So figuring out deportation for veterans, I'm in the subcommittee that's looking at that. The other is economic opportunity. Today, for example, I'll be filing my first bill in veteran affairs on how to protect veterans who are going to for-profit schools who are being defrauded and they're losing their scholarship benefits. So I wanted to be in a place where I could actually do something about housing, about education, and I get to do that in Veteran Affairs Committee. I'll have an amendment this week, and I'll be able to work on a markup by the end of the month. The second was immigration. Look, Lynn, you've heard me say this. My mother crossed the border pregnant of me. She crossed and nearly got deported. She had been deported once before. And it was a realization that Congresswoman Barragan gave me 2 weeks ago. She said, you're in Homeland Security. You are now the vice ranking member, the number 2 to the ranking member. You're in every committee now. You serve in various other committees. You have 2 specific committees, but did your mom know when she crossed the border and nearly got deported that in her womb, she was carrying the boss of the boss of the boss of the boss of that border officer? I now oversee Border Patrol, FEMA, election protection, cybersecurity, and it's full circle, right? So it is to me, while they weren't our number 1, I see Jonathan and we look at each other, we're really having fun and having an opportunity to really work on the issues we care about in the committees we serve on.
So you're saying you're going to do this as a separate bill or just as an amendment? So
I have a bill in the Veteran Affairs Committee, I have my own amendment, And it's going to be a bill that's going to create, it's going to put onus on these private schools for defrauding veterans. Right now, if you're a veteran and you're going to school, and let's say it was a ITT, somehow went under, it bankrupt. The veteran loses their scholarship benefits, won't get their degree, and now will have to go to school and pay out of pocket.
And this private school thing is something, as you probably know, Senator Durbin has done a lot of work on.
That's right.
Jonathan, what will your first bill be when you have it? And forgive me if you just have dropped it. And I just checked this morning and maybe I missed it.
Well, my first bill is going to be on trying to reform these antiquated minority participation rules. They've not been updated for disadvantaged business, minority businesses, Blacks in business.
Mm-hmm.
That are all sort of protections that are out there. And as these markets are very capricious and the winds blow very strongly, there's protection for the wealthiest and the poorest are left out to dry. And so that's what I've been laboring on. And you should look forward to hearing more about that in the weeks ahead.
Okay, so now another reality check. Freshmen, Democrats, and this Republican-led Congress, unless it's some extraordinary coalition you put together, a standalone bill will not pass. That is the experience that everyone has. It's hard even when the Democrats held power a few months ago. Usually, if it's a really good idea or a concept, it becomes part of a larger bill. The route to becoming law is tough. Have either of you, without, I want to move on to some other topics, but do you find it daunting or to see the hill you got to climb to get something passed?
Well, Delia, if you will, I'll step in. You try, both of our journeys getting to this point were very improbable. And so we've made it this far. It's exciting. And then you realize it's 435 people that you have to convince. And then it's 218 to get to the other side. So we're halfway there. So Delia and I both start off looking at, we're halfway there. So we're at 212 on the Democrat side. We get 6 other people to come join us. It's not that far a leap. So
well, yes, when you get through the committees. But let me ask you, speaking of your colleagues, have either of you talked to George Santos at all? Mm-hmm. The New York Republican and the serial fabricator?
I've not.
I've only seen him in passing, and he greets me every time like he knows me. So I have not had the opportunity to talk to him for much.
So can you tell me, right now the Illinois delegation has 3 Republicans, 14 Democrats. Have you met or talked to Mary Miller or Mike Bost or Darren LaHood, the Republicans? Congressman Jackson and then Congressman Ramirez. Have you met the Republicans from Illinois?
Yes, I've met 2, Mary Miller and Congressman LaHood.
And I serve, actually, the chairman of Veteran Affairs is Mike Bost. So I've had an opportunity to work with him. Actually, I have found them to be really, really good in committee and really helpful as I've contributed to the committee.
And thank you for reminding me that could be a big deal for you, couldn't it?
Yeah. And of course, I thought of that as, how do I work with an Illinoisan that really cares deeply about veterans? And I think it's been also helpful that he gets to see that I really want to make a difference around housing and education for veterans. So that's been really nice as we've talked about potential markups on my bill.
Right. And also that gets you away in those issues, gets you away from hot button issues, social issues, cultural issues, usually in Congress, if it's kind of a straightforward veteran housing issue. Also, I should point out that even in the Democratic Congress under Speaker Pelosi, there were no Illinois chairman of the committees. And now under this Republican Congress, we do have one from Illinois, Congressman Michael Bost, who some of our listeners may not be familiar with because he is from a downstate district, but he's worked for many years on veterans affairs. One of the things that both of you are members now of the House Progressive Caucus. But I noticed in your votes, you're not lockstep with each other. And here's what the two votes I found most interesting. On March 8th, there is a vote to remove the US troops from Syria. Now that measure failed. It was an unusual coalition because the farthest right members, like Mary Miller from Illinois, all of a sudden were on the same page as Delia Ramirez and Jan Schakowsky and Chuy Garcia and others. Congressman Jackson, you were a no vote. Could either of you jump in and explain the progressive split on this one for people who are usually allies and this kind of strange bedfellow coalition on that one? And was this a true progressive split or not?
No, I don't look at this as a progressive split. There are so many angles to these complex issues now. And so between the Russians have a base in Syria, and how we're dealing with the Ukrainian issue, I just simply want us to move a little slower. Some people want to be more aggressive. So I didn't look at that as a pushback from progressive values, just a matter of timing.
And Delia, what's your thought on that?
Yeah, no, I agree with Jonathan. I mean, we had a long conversation at our CPC retreat about it, you know, and where folks were. And I think people were conflicted up until voting for it, right? For the reasons that Jonathan brought up. You know, some of us kept thinking about, particularly someone like me who's in the Veteran Affairs Committee, you know, is it necessary for our military, for our people who are representing us and fighting for us to continue to be in Syria? And the answer is, as we looked at the complications of it, it really felt like, you know, a vote yes was a bigger vote than just that particular issue. Was really looking out in the way that we look at our service members every single day and our politics, right? So I definitely think there's going to be a number of them where you're going to see different CPC members voting, really looking at the different angles of this really complicated issue.
Well, they did. There was another split when in the February resolution condemning socialism, which the Republicans ginned up just to have Democrats have a vote they didn't want. You two were split. You were part, Delia, of the Democrats, again with Chuy Garcia, Jan Schakowsky, Danny Davis, and Robin Kelly, who voted against condemning socialism. Jonathan Jackson, you did not you were on the other side on that vote.
Yeah, I thought that was just a political ploy. So I stuck my neck out to say, come on, you're not going to catch me with some debate fodder in the future to say I was pro-socialism. So that was kind of a throwaway vote for all of us, you know. So I respect Congresswoman Delia for taking the right stance on not agreeing with it, but mine was more optics. Like, I'm not a socialist, and I'm not going to let them start a debate on, he voted for socialism. Get out of here. And, you know, and the other point I want to say is that I'm on Foreign Affairs, and Congresswoman Delia. Can I call you Congresswoman Delia? Or
yes, you can. Or Delia.
Being on Foreign Affairs, the first committee hearing that we had was to see veterans that were coming out of Afghanistan. And the stories that they shared were just heart-wrenching to see 25-year-old veterans that are amputees that have been left behind, you know, that are like missing limbs and are crying before the committee, recounting the testimony of their experiences, and the service members that are digging in their pockets to pay for Afghanis to try to repatriate to the United States that have had all diplomatic channels cut off. It's just gut-wrenching. So I would just say that in context of Syria and other places, that you are looking at the policy and you're also looking at the individual human lives, and it becomes, you know, you may make a decision based upon that human element or the policy element, but you're trying to go in the right direction.
So both of you, speaking of progressive politics, both of you came out early. We're now moving to the Chicago mayoral race in our last few minutes on the show here. Both of you came out early for Brandon Johnson, and not your congressional colleague, Chuy Jesus Garcia, who, by the way, by coincidence, has an office in the House Longworth building next to Congresswoman Ramirez. I guess you have to figure out relationships now that obviously we all know he lost the first vote. Besides patching up relationships with him or having to figure out how you work on a human scale, has that happened already? You know, what's the relationship between you two now? Because you do have to work with him in the delegation.
Well, I would just say, look, yes, we're actually next door to each other, and we have an opportunity to see each other often. I saw his chief of staff actually late last week, the last time we were here. Look, I'm in a relationship with Chewy. Chewy and I talked a lot before I made my endorsement of Brandon. He knew it was coming, and he is someone that understands our roots and our work, and he's committed to working together. I have nothing but respect for him. Yeah, Jonathan, I know you wanted to add something about that too.
Oh, sure. Lynn, let me be clear. Chewy is my friend. I love Chewy. I mean, our relationship is long and deep, and that was like probably just because of timing. Chewy was it was Commissioner Stanley Moore to endorse me, the only elected official to stand with me when I endorsed, and the second endorsement for my campaign came from Congressman Garcia. And so when he had asked me, and I'd already told him that in July, I'd made a commitment to Brandon, who was gathering his support. And so if you're talking about splitting hairs and something painful, not to lend my support to my friend, that was it. And that was a matter of, I can say also timing, but we're all in the progressive family. I was with Chewy yesterday afternoon on the floor, and I love his spirit. He's never had a grimace towards me. He's never lost any friendship with me, even during the course of the campaign. I saw him working triple time, voting on the floor and going back to Chicago and doing all those great things. So to Chewy, I even have more respect for him now. I didn't know it could get any greater, but a gentleman and a statesman. And so Chewy's a friend, and honored to call him so.
So since we know you're for Brandon, I'm going to ask what is going to happen with turnout. I'm not looking for you to talk up the merits or demerits of Paul Vallis and Brandon, but turnout is the key for either of them, because both Vallis and Brandon Johnson got into the runoff with far less than 50%. They need a lot of turnout. Either new voters, or they need to get the voters who voted for Mayor Lightfoot and Chewy Garcia into their camps. Just because both of you know politics, Congressman Jackson first, do you think turnout is, what is going to happen with turnout in the city?
Unfortunately, I can see that it can be low. That's the history of negative campaigns when people become despondent. So I was very appreciative for Dalia's campaign and mine. Just say who you are, stay above the fray, get to the issues, give people a reason to vote for something, not to vote against something. And I am concerned if the campaign is turned negative, a consequence would be for there to be lower voter turnout. And so
yeah.
Okay, please go on.
I was going to say, I agree with Congressman Jackson. Look, right now, there are two things that need to happen. You have, and they all have to do with turnout, right? Persuasion is incredibly important. Making sure that people feel moved enough to feel like they have to go and vote. And so getting out the vote is the priority. And that can't be done, I would say, just through commercials. I know that candidates always assume if I can get $10 million of commercials, it's going to happen. To Jonathan's point, that often creates apathy because it's mostly negative messages about each other. Where I think we really have an opportunity, and I would say this for both of them, right, is the field program. Look, this past weekend, I was in various places sending out folks to canvass in rallies. There are 150 people in the Northwest side going out for Brandon. What I know what's going to be most important is those one-on-one conversations at the door. People cannot underestimate, specifically because of turnout, the work of field.
Old-fashioned door knocking.
And drag them to the polls. That's really what's going to have to happen.
You're talking vinyl records here.
That's exactly what I'm talking.
People think motivates people. We're out of time. Otherwise, we probably could go on all day just talking about the mayoral race. Thank you very much, Congressman Jonathan Jackson.
Can I add just one thing? I am so proud
Please do.
that on the last part of the mayoral piece is Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky,
That's right.
Congressman Danny Davis, Congressman Chuy Garcia, Congresswoman Delia Ramirez, and myself have all endorsed Brandon Johnson. So I can certainly speak at this moment from the federal level that we've all been pro public education, pro strengthening our labor organization and labor rights. And so we're all excited about our support for Mayor Johnson. We want to push back on privatization, charterization of our schools.
Not mayor yet. You called him Mayor Johnson.
We're speaking in we're prophesizing here, right, Jonathan? It's prophetic.
But here's the thing, because I know we're running out of time. You brought it up, but just so our listeners know, there is a big endorsement back and forth going on. Paul Vallis has a stack of endorsements. Johnson has a stack on it, and that is, we'll see what the impact is of it and who turns out. I appreciate the points all of you made on this conversation with our two Chicago area freshmen. Thank you for joining us, and I'm sure and hope we can be back again to check in to see how the freshmen are doing. All the best more later. Thank you everyone for joining me at this edition of After.